Whenever people bring up Nolan Ryan, the media is always obsessed with the numbers. 5,714 strikeouts, 7 no-hitters, those fastballs tearing through the air at over 100 miles an hour. But me, I was just a no-name bullpen catcher. I lugged my gear right alongside Nolan starting out in California with the Angels, through the years in Houston with the Astros, all the way to the end of the line with the Texas Rangers. And I got to see a completely different side of the man. My hands are still covered in calluses from catching thousands of his pitches behind closed doors. But the trade-off was getting to sit quietly next to him after those grueling, high-stakes games. Nolan was a tough, quiet guy. He never gave anyone a free pass just because they had their name in the papers or a bunch of awards on their shelf. What he respected more than anything else was pure durability. If you want to know who the Ryan Express truly admired over a 27-year career, you won't find it in the sports section. You have to walk through the clubhouse doors and see exactly who Nolan chose to sit next to. The very first name that comes to mind, a guy Nolan had absolute, unquestioned respect for, is Rod Carew. Back when we were sharing a locker room with the California Angels, Rod was already an absolute monument in this game. He had piled up every batting title and accolade a hitter could ever dream of. But the honest truth is, if you walked into that Angels clubhouse back then and didn't know what Rod looked like, you would have sworn he was a rookie fighting tooth and nail just to keep a spot on the bench. Rod possessed this quiet, almost unbelievable level of professionalism. There was no noise. He never tried to act like the superstar or make himself the center of attention. Nolan was always incredibly sharp when it came to observing his teammates, and he always kept an eye on how Rod prepared before a game. From my spot hanging around the bullpen, I used to see Nolan just standing in the corner of the room, arms crossed, quietly nodding to himself as he watched Rod dial into every single minor detail. There was never any wasted motion. While a lot of the other veterans had a habit of leaning on their past experience, Rod prepared like he had absolutely nothing to his name. It didn't matter if we were riding high on a massive winning streak or drowning in a miserable slump. Rod's attitude never shifted an inch. He maintained this frightening level of consistency. Nolan used to say that over a long, grinding season, talent might get your foot in the door of the big leagues, but iron discipline is the only thing that keeps you there. And Rod Carew was the walking definition of discipline. Both Nolan and I understood that the most valuable thing about Rod wasn't just the magic he worked with a bat in his hands out on the field. It was the absolute peace of mind he brought to the team. You always knew exactly what you were going to get the second he buttoned up that jersey. When Nolan and I packed up our lockers and moved on to the Houston Astros, we walked into a clubhouse that was starting to build something special. And right in the middle of it all was a kid named Craig Biggio. If there was one thing Nolan absolutely could not stand, it was a player who took his God-given talent for granted. He despised laziness in any form. But Craig was the exact opposite of that. He was a walking, talking spark plug. I remember watching him when he first came up to the show. He always played the game at this incredibly high, almost frantic speed. He cared deeply about every single inning, every single pitch. From my spot out in the bullpen, I'd see him sprinting down the first baseline on a routine ground ball like his life depended on it. Nolan loved that kind of relentless fire. But the thing that truly cemented Nolan's respect for Craig, and mine too, was his ultimate sacrifice for the organization. A lot of people forget that Craig actually came up to the big leagues as a catcher. It is a brutal, physically demanding position, and he was an all-star at it. But the front office realized they needed his bat in the lineup every day, which meant moving him away from the plate. So he accepted a massive transition all the way out to second base. People outside the game really don't realize how insanely difficult that switch is at the major league level. It is an extreme, punishing change of footwork and instinct that takes years to master. But Craig did it without a single complaint to the media or the manager. He did it because he truly believed it gave the Astros a better shot at winning a championship. You had to earn your keep around him every single day. But you didn't need to hear him say it out loud. You could see the respect in the way he looked at Craig. He saw a guy who was willing to completely reinvent himself for the sake of his teammates. Craig wasn't just a great ball player with good numbers. He was the absolute heartbeat of that Houston team. And Nolan valued that kind of pure, unselfish grit over almost anything else in the sport. While we were in Houston during those early years of the 1990s, another kid walked into the clubhouse who would eventually turn the entire franchise upside down. That was Jeff Bagwell. When the Astros really started getting strong and making noise in the division, Jeff naturally became the face of the organization. He was the guy hitting the massive, game-winning home runs. He was the guy landing on all the major sports magazine covers. But the reason Nolan had so much genuine affection for Jeff was entirely because of how he handled that massive, blinding spotlight. In professional sports, when a young kid suddenly becomes a superstar, you almost always see a shift in his personality. They start acting like the rules don't apply to them, or like they are somehow bigger than the team itself. Jeff never did that, not even for a single day. Despite carrying the weight of the franchise on his shoulders, he remained incredibly grounded and humble. I spent a lot of time just sitting back and watching the dynamic in that clubhouse. Jeff always treated the older, grizzled veterans with the absolute utmost respect. And at the exact same time, he would go completely out of his way to help the struggling young rookies who were just desperately trying to find their footing in the big leagues. Nolan, who was the ultimate old-school veteran by that point in his career, deeply admired that specific trait. Nolan absolutely despised arrogance in ball players, and Jeff didn't have a single arrogant bone in his entire body. What also caught Nolan's eye, time and time again, was Jeff's obsessive level of preparation. Long before the turnstiles opened and the fans even started filling the stadium seats, Jeff was already completely locked in. He took his pre-game routine more seriously than almost anyone I ever saw. I am talking about taking hundreds of extra grueling swings in the batting cage underneath the bleachers. He made sure to get his mind perfectly right before the first pitch of the game was ever even thrown. Nolan would sit quietly by his locker, adjusting his cleats, just observing Jeff go about his business day after day. Jeff proved to Nolan that you could be a genuine superstar, hit the absolute cover of the baseball, and still act like a humble, blue-collar teammate. Finding that rare combination of elite talent and pure humility is exactly why Nolan loved having him in the same dugout. When the ride finally took us to Arlington, and we put on the Texas Rangers uniform for the last chapter of Nolan's career, the clubhouse was full of established veterans. But the guy who ended up breathing absolute fire into that team was just a teenager. His name was Ivan Rodriguez, though everyone quickly just knew him as Pudge. I had been around professional baseball a long time by then, and I had caught my fair share of talented arms. But let me tell you, when this kid walked into the room, he brought a level of raw, unfiltered energy that even a hardened veteran like Nolan couldn't help but admire. And Ivan did exactly that every single night he put on the gear. As a catcher myself, I paid extremely close attention to Ivan during those early days. It was completely impossible not to. What he could do from behind the plate was just unnatural. The thing about Ivan wasn't just that he had an absolute cannon for a right arm. It was the fact that his arm was a literal weapon that completely altered the geometry of the game. He forced entire major league organizations to tear up their scouting reports and change their offensive strategies before the umpire even yelled play ball. Opposing managers were literally terrified to call a steal when he was crouched behind the plate. You don't see one defensive player completely paralyze another team like that very often in this sport. But what made Nolan truly love having the kid around was his relentless competitive spirit. Nolan was in his mid-40s by the time we were playing together in Texas. His body was constantly hurting from decades of throwing heat. But seeing a kid like Ivan out there, fearlessly blocking breaking pitches in the dirt, throwing absolute lasers to second base, and demanding perfection from every pitcher on the staff, it gave the older guys a massive jolt of electricity. Ivan didn't care if you were a rookie call-up or a living legend like the Ryan Express. He expected you to bring the absolute fight of your life to the mound. Nolan always respected a ball player who left every single ounce of himself out on the dirt. And Ivan did exactly that every single night he put on the gear. Now, the last name on this list is a bit of a special case. He wasn't a guy we shared a foxhole with for 162 games a season. But if you're talking about the people Nolan truly loved and respected the most in this world, you absolutely have to talk about Johnny Bench. Nolan and Johnny were really the defining symbols of 1970s baseball. They traveled on completely different paths, but they understood the immense weight of carrying a franchise better than anybody else. Whenever our paths crossed with Cincinnati, or later on at various events, I always made sure to stay close by and just listen when Nolan and Johnny got together. It was like sitting in on a masterclass between two of the greatest baseball minds God ever created. The thing that always blew Nolan away, and me too, was Johnny's memory. It was legitimately supernatural. I watched Johnny sit there with a cold drink and casually break down a specific at-bat against Nolan from 2 decades earlier. He could tell you the exact count, where the catcher was set up, what the pitch was, and exactly how the baseball felt coming off the bat. He described it all as if the game had just ended that very afternoon. He had an entire encyclopedia of baseball history locked inside his head. But despite having that massive intellect, and despite being arguably the greatest catcher to ever put on a chest protector, Johnny never acted like a legend. He was just one of the guys. He never felt the need to build a wall around himself to protect his ego. If you were a first ballot Hall of Famer like Nolan, or just a tired, broken down bullpen catcher like me, Johnny treated you with the exact same warmth and respect. He was incredibly approachable. As I said before, Nolan absolutely despised arrogance. He couldn't stand guys who thought the game owed them something just because they were talented. He simply loved talking baseball. He loved the camaraderie of the men who played it, and he never created any distance between himself and the people around him. The mutual respect between the ultimate power pitcher and the ultimate catcher was a beautiful thing to witness. Nolan didn't just respect Johnny as a fellow ball player. He genuinely treasured him as a friend. Nolan hung up his cleats a long time ago, and my knees certainly don't let me crouch down in a bullpen anymore. The years really do go by fast in this game. When Nolan and I occasionally get on the phone these days, we don't talk about the 100-mile-an-hour fastballs. We never really bring up the strikeout records or the historic no-hitters. Instead, we talk about the guys. We talk about the quiet iron discipline of Rod Carew. We talk about the ultimate sacrifice and pure grit of Craig Biggio. We remember the humble greatness of a superstar like Jeff Bagwell. We laugh about the fiery, unfiltered youth of Ivan Rodriguez. And we always bring up the brilliant, welcoming mind of Johnny Bench. Because at the end of the day, the championship trophies just gathered dust on a shelf. The box scores fade away in the archives of old newspapers. But the brothers you went to battle with, those memories stay with you until the very end of the line. The game of baseball was truly great, but the people were even better. That is our story from the trenches. But now I am genuinely curious about yours. If you had to pick the most respected and beloved players in baseball history, who would make your own list? Let me know down in the comments section.